think that all of those, I mean, you're talking about postmodern and the tradition and this and that, but there are a lot of readers who aren't really, who haven't been schooled in either of those areas. Do you think that the fact that you feel like your poetry has to be so aware of all of this history of poetry would make it inaccessible to, I mean, do you ever worry about that, or?
Well, for me, accessibility, although I know that this is just a terrible thing to say and have on record, but for me, accessibility has actually always been really important. You know, however much I'm interested in experimentalism, and I'm really interested in it, particularly on a linguistic level, you know, I don't feel any of that, much of anything that happened in the 20th century is inaccessible to readers. I think that it's, you know, for a variety of cultural reasons, things that they don't try to access and aren't perhaps particularly interested in accessing, but there's nothing, you know, like Susan Howe isn't hard, and Susan Howe is really beautiful, you know. There's nothing that any reader, you know, you can read that stuff. You can read language poetry. You can read, you know, a lot of avant-garde work. For me, the idea has always been to take that awareness, you know, and make it work in a way that I would like to think anybody could pick it up and read. You know, and that's in a lot of ways where I feel, at least in my own work, where the tradition and, you know, my deep and abiding love of, you know, all things avant-garde sort of meet and kind of duke it out. You know, I want both to work. Do you feel that in your own work?
Yeah, I mean, I do. I feel like, in a way, I mean, when we're talking about accessibility, I feel like poetry should be as clear as the poet is in their mind or their heart. And sometimes that's not clear. So I think, I mean, in a way, I feel like I don't want to create a false space in which I am more certain. Like, I don't think that accessibility should mean dogma or certainty. And so, I mean, I would hope that somebody could come to my poem or a poem of mine and feel, even if there wasn't like a direct narrative, you know, I wasn't telling a story in a way that somebody might have come to expect from a certain kind of literature, that there were emotions or ideas or images that were clear enough to reach somebody. So yes, I mean, I definitely think that in a way we're back to this idea of morality, you know, that there's like that I strive to be as clear as I can to myself, and as clear as language can be. And so I don't think there should ever be a trickiness or like a willful, or the word be like obfuscation. But within that, I think like the world is pretty complicated. So you know, I think that a little bit of work on the part of the reader, work on the part of the poet, I think is okay.
And I think that obscurity and obfuscation and clarity can be used together, you know, and they can heighten each other in a way that I think is really, you know, useful for the reader. I mean, I think that's actually a lot of what I do or try to do in poetry. I actually get from music, and that's been happening in music for the past, particularly popular music, the past 20 years or so. Those two have been really since the Jesus and Mary chain, to be perfectly honest and direct. Really since that kind of like just shearing terrible noise with these sort of Beach Boys type melodies came together, and you had to deal with both at once, because Jesus and Mary chain were both avant-garde and very traditional. People have sort of recognized that, you know, they heighten each other, and so I think that's a good awareness to take into poetry.
Speaking of ceremony, I suppose this gets into like, you know, the sort of how you write. You know, some people are like 10 a.m. every day. Ceremony, you know, and then like, you know, like I prepare my tea and then I take my tea bag out after 2.5 minutes, or is it like, you know, which, and maybe now you're feeling a little more because you said you want some of these occasion poems. You're like, you know what, 10 a.m. tea thing not working for me now. Like a bird just flew into my hair. Now I'm gonna write. Yeah,
that's more where I'm at right now. Like I said, I mean, I had 2 years where I was like just on it all the time, and now no, I feel like, in a way, writing for me is more about like constant attention and readiness than it is about the act of putting a word on the paper. I feel like I always have my notebook. I'm always looking at the world through poetry, and then, you know, the actual poem happens or it doesn't.
Yeah, this is a thing that actually I feel it's a big deal for me, because a lot of people, particularly when you first get to the workshop, a lot of people have their rituals and they talk about it, but I think ritualizing the act of writing is extremely dangerous to being a writer, because I think it is really easy to make the ritual the art and you don't even notice it.
Okay.
When I first turned 20, I used to wake up at a certain time. I used to do a certain thing with my typewriter, all this kind of nonsense. And what ends up happening is when you've got yourself ready to write, you already feel like you've sort of done it. You're like, I've done all of my ritual steps. I almost feel like I've written, because that's what I do when I write, And so I realized that that's not going to work. You substitute the ritual, it starts to take on the feeling of the act,
right? And
then you're not really doing it anymore. So I had to give all that stuff up, and also having children at a very young age helped. And so children won't let you do that, and so it got to the point where I just write poems as I walk down the street or in class. That the longest poem in that chapbook that you read, One Neither One, I wrote while I was working at a law firm. They were paying me $2,300 a week when I wrote that poem.
That probably made you the highest paid poet in the country.
For that minute. I wrote that while I was doing work. So I mean, I think that when you don't have to do that ritual stuff, it actually sort of allows you to be, like you were saying, Dora, sort of attentive to everything. And I think that's really the best way to work, at least for me.
And I gotta say, I think it's probably different for prose writers than for poets, because if you gotta crank out a certain number of words, you kind of have to make yourself sit down and do it. So in a way, it's a luxury, and I feel like, there's Bruce Lee's The Art of Fighting Without Fighting, and so this is kind of like the art of writing without writing, where all of your thoughts, all the stuff you're not putting on paper is kind of building up to what you end up crafting. So yeah, I think there's, I mean, maybe I'm in denial, but I think there's more going on, inside before a poem manifests itself on paper.
Yeah,
sure.